An unpublished report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, seen by journalists, outlines the vast and urgent climate threats facing the planet. One of the most pressing concerns is rising sea levels, which the report says will likely cause mass migration and eventually force whole cities to be abandoned. And as Rahul Radhakrishnan reports, the effects are already evident.
Imagine if a city like Dhaka, with a population of nearly 9 million people, had to be completely abandoned. An unpublished report by the UN's Climate Science Advisory Panel says that could become a reality. The study warns that climate change is swelling our oceans, redrawing our maps, and putting hundreds of millions of lives and livelihoods at risk. Bangladesh's capital is located in a low-lying delta, and more than 40% of its residents live in informal settlements. Scientists predict that by 2050, almost 1 million of those residents will be displaced by rising sea levels. And with frequent flash floods around the country, many are already getting a taste of what's to come.
I was once a bride of an affluent family. My in-laws and parents, they had everything: cattle, a nice house, farmland, but the river took it all away. After that, we came to Dhaka, working as domestic helpers. It is a day in and day out job for us.
Dhaka is not alone. 11 other coastal cities, including 4 in the US, are severely affected by rising sea levels. Indonesia's capital, Jakarta, is already sinking. Environmentalists warn that a third of it could be submerged in the next 3 decades. The city has built a protective seawall, and the country's government is planning to relocate its capital to Borneo Island. In southern Europe, Venice has now become the most threatened heritage site in the region. Over 90% of it is vulnerable to flooding. The city has installed mobile barriers to close lagoon inlets during storms.
Since the median sea level is increasing, floods are more frequent. We used to have 2 to 3 a year. In the last year, we have had 20.
Due to the greenhouse effect, Earth's climate is 1.2 degrees warmer now than at the beginning of last century. The heating is causing glaciers and ice sheets near the poles to melt, driving up sea levels by more than 8 millimeters so far. The UN panel forecasts a rise between 30 and 110 centimeters by 2100 if current emissions continue. As they struggle to cope with the rise of just 8 millimeters, coastal cities are proving to be squarely on the front lines of the climate crisis. Rahul Radhakrishnan, TRT World.
Sharon George is a senior lecturer of environmental science at Keele University. She says rising sea levels are not only putting coastal cities at risk of sinking, it could also lead to other socio-economic issues.
The more that we are producing greenhouse gases, the more we're driving up temperatures, the more the ice is melting. But this is exacerbated. It's not just one effect on it by itself. The rising sea levels are then exacerbated by a combined effect through rising temperature. So a rise in sea temperature drives storms. So imagine the impact that you've got already, like the amount of people who live in coastal areas having their livelihoods threatened by more storms driven by this climate change. This is inundating land with water. This is changing land. So farmers are struggling because the land is becoming saline, and this is driving people into cities. This situation is just exacerbating, and it's driving human migration. And it is a problem that we need to deal with urgently, globally. We're talking about holding the sea back and engineering areas to keep this water back. And yet we have to ask ourselves, is this economically viable? And, in places where we're seeing, just the amount of water and these surges, there's one thing being able to plan for a gradual rise in water, but then when you couple that with the surges that we see and the sudden inundation of water, and you need to think as well that a lot of the places that are the most vulnerable are often the places that are the least able to put these mitigations in place. So there's a lot of vulnerable people who are affected by this issue, and this is going to massively drive huge human migration as one of the biggest impacts of what we're seeing in these images. I think this is part of the problem that up until now, climate change and our global emissions are somewhat of they've been up until now quite an invisible problem for a lot of us. It's hard to imagine that this invisible gas can create these problems that are often far removed from where we live and work. So, and another problem that's exacerbating this is that not all countries are affected in the same way. So those countries that are impacted the most and have their GDP impacted more by these impacts are the ones that perhaps have the least power to do anything about it. So countries like the US, whose GDP is perhaps not quite so affected by these issues, have a big influence in affecting global emissions and being able to curb this through control of global carbon emissions.